My name is Behrens. I'm a volunteer at the National Steinbeck Center, and I have worked in the archives of the National Steinbeck Center for about 10 or 11 years. And one of the things, or several of the things that I've been doing at the center is to enter into a database the information that they have in their horizontal files, the newspaper clippings. I have entered in photographs, letters, oral history tapes, videotapes that have, and anything that pertains to John Steinbeck. Also in the collection, the other two collections we have are archival material on the agricultural history, because we had an agricultural wing at the Steinbeck Center called the Valley of the World. And then we also have information about the Steinbeck Center itself, how it began at the National Steinbeck Foundation, began their information that they have about how it was formulated, plans of the original center, formations incorporated, the company who put the exhibits together. The other thing that I do at the Steinbeck Center is to support the staff in any questions that they might have about John Steinbeck or his life and writings. I answer emails that come in from students or other people who are interested in John Steinbeck or who want to do research at the Steinbeck Center. We have almost 50,000 items in our archives pertaining to John Steinbeck, his life, his writings, and books about the writings and books about the books about the writings. So there's a lot of information there for it. The several unique features that we have are original manuscripts, original letters, signed copies of his books, and ephemera that pertains to Steinbeck, his life, and his family. So we also I also participate as a tour of the archives during the Steinbeck Festival, which usually takes place, or had usually taken place, in August of each year, which had been begun at the Salinas Library. This year, or next year, the Steinbeck Festival is going to be in May. Well, the Steinbeck Center offered information about John Steinbeck, and the very early ones were even more detailed as to his works, his friends, because at the time that they started over 15 years ago, there were people who had lived in Salinas or lived in Monterey who knew John Steinbeck, who had worked with John Steinbeck, or even some of them had gone to school with John Steinbeck. So there was a very personal relationship in this respect. Scholars from all over the world, Japan, United States, Russia, have come to the Steinbeck festivals, have talked about various things about John Steinbeck or his writings. Each festival has a theme. For example, last year's or this year's theme was friendship. And some of the books that were considered were Tortilla Flat, The Moon is Down, Cannery Row, books in which John Steinbeck wrote about people and their relationship to each other in the way of friendship. And we were able to talk about people that John Steinbeck knew. For example, Professor Susan Schillinglaw, who was a noted Steinbeck scholar here in the Bay Area, or in the Monterey area, talked about the relationship between John Steinbeck and Robinson Jeffers. Now, Robinson Jeffers was a noted poet who lived in Carmel. Interesting enough, John Steinbeck and Robinson Jeffers had never met, but Steinbeck was influenced quite a bit by Jeffers' poetry. So the festivals are 4 days in length. They've expanded from being strictly a John Steinbeck interest to John Steinbeck and the rest of the world. We have, or had last time, events that happened in other parts of the world, interesting conversation with people at Somerset in Brighton, England, where John Steinbeck had lived for about 6 months while he was in the process of working on his book that eventually was titled Acts of King Arthur. So this is a process, this is events that are going to be taking place probably throughout the United States and other parts of the world, each festival. What the theme for next festival is probably Steinbeck's voice, the effect of words and stories that Steinbeck has written. and I understand it's going to be also correlated with Woody Guthrie. I arrived in 1995, my wife and I, after we retired. Why we were living here and had been interested in Ed Ricketts because of an exhibit that the Monterey Aquarium had done on the Sea of Cortez trip that Ed and John Steinbeck had taken. And so we became interested in this. We met some people from the Cannery Row Foundation, Neil and Bettina Hotelling. We met Michael Hemp, who is a historian of the Cannery Row area. And I became interested in what people were saying about John Steinbeck, the fact that he had lived here and written one of his books, and of course he had lived in Pacific Grove and written 3 or 4 of his books from there. So I wanted to know a little bit more about him. So I was introduced to John Hooper, who was the registrar and archivist at the National Steinbeck Center, and I became interested in going through and cataloging some of the newspaper clippings. And the more I cataloged, the more I knew, and the more I knew, the more I wanted to know. And each time I would go there, I would find another mosaic that would fit into the pattern of John Steinbeck. And it helped me in understanding who John Steinbeck was, or trying to understand him. He was a very complex, contradictory in many cases, man, a wonderful writer, and he had a interesting personality that he presented not only in his writing, but also in his letters. Fortunately, he was a very prolific letter writer, and we have some of his original letters. A lot of his letters have been published into a book called Steinbeck, A Life and Letters, and this is a wonderful addition to the biography that Jackson Benson had written. So the more you read about not only the books, and the more you read about people who criticize and analyze his books, the more you know about not only his books, his writings, both fiction and nonfiction, but also the person himself. The Steinbeck exhibit in the Steinbeck Museum was a brainstorm and an idea by several men and women affiliated with the public life in Salinas, as well as the Salinas Library. At that time it was called the Salinas Public Library. It later changed its name to the John Steinbeck Public Library. And they began to realize that here was a man who had won the Nobel Prize, who were born and raised in Salinas, but there really wasn't anything memorable there to honor him. And there was the Steinbeck House, of course, where he had lived, and which is now a historical site, of course. But there wasn't any real good collection of his works, for example, a collection of his writings in any way. So it was felt that even though he was buried here, his father and mother were buried here, his sister Mary was buried here, and so they felt that it was important for the city of Salinas to have some tie with John Steinbeck. And this is when they decided to, in some way, make a building for him. The object of the building was to not only house the Steinbeck archives, which at that time were at the library, after running out of room, but is also going to be a meeting place for the community. The various civic organizations would meet there. It would also be a way in which the 100 block of Main Street would be helped to be improved and redeveloped. The Formations Incorporated company was the one that had been picked to do the exhibit. And their ideas, from what I know, because I was not involved with them in any way, their idea was to show through the books and through the visuals, the film clips, pictures, photographs, and recordings that John Steinbeck had made, the life of John Steinbeck through his books. So it starts off with not only John Steinbeck's family, but then immediately goes to what was Salinas like. And they use his wonderful, very large book, East of Eden, because it is set in, a lot of it is set in Salinas. And he uses specific places. And that got him into a lot of trouble, because not only did he use specific places, but he also, as he did in almost all of his work, used real people, although he changed the names. And so a lot of the people living there, who had lived there at the time that Steinbeck was writing, were unhappy with the way he treated his characters, who were thinly disguised as, say, the sheriff or the bartender or the brothel owner or things like that. But John Steinbeck did this all the time in all of his books. His paisanos, his Mac and the boys from Cannery Row were people that he knew and were composites. In fact, he specifically said in one of his interviews that John Steinbeck, that his characters were composites of people that he knew. And so this got him in a little bit of trouble, not besides the trouble that he apparently was in when he published his book, Grapes of Wrath. And although the setting of Grapes of Wrath was in Kern County in the Bakersfield area, there were a lot of people who were unhappy with the way he portrayed the realistic portrayal, I think, of the migrant workers. So the Steinbeck Museum and Center tries to show not only John Steinbeck, but to show John Steinbeck's the people in the world and how they have been portrayed in John Steinbeck's works, which is a very universal way.